The sky over Crete trembled before anyone on the ground understood why. It began as a distant murmur, a sound too steady to be thunder but too deep to be wind. Shepherds on the hills paused mid-step. British lookouts scanned the horizon with growing unease. Civilians stood frozen outside their white-walled homes, heads tilted upward as the vibration thickened. And then, in a moment that stretched like slow lightning across the Mediterranean air, they saw it, a dark swarm of German aircraft forming a cloud of wings, engines, and falling shadows. What no one knew yet was that this would become one of the most dramatic and desperate battles of the entire war, a moment when a small island became the stage for the greatest airborne invasion the world had ever seen. This was the beginning of a story written in dust, fire, and courage. Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we take you deep into one of the most intense and crucial episodes of World War II, the Battle of Crete. This is not just a chapter in military history. It is a human story of strategy, bravery, misjudgment, and survival, told against the backdrop of an island that refused to surrender easily. In this episode, we explore the early tension, the buildup, and the dramatic opening phase of the airborne assault. To understand this battle, we must begin with the cracks forming long before the first paratrooper jumped from a plane. The story begins weeks earlier, as German high command looked southward across the Mediterranean. Following their rapid advance through the Balkans, the German leadership identified Crete as a potential threat. Its airfields, particularly Maleme, Heraklion, and Rethymno, were valuable stepping stones into the eastern Mediterranean. Control of these positions would give the Allies reach toward the oil fields of Romania and the southern Balkans, something the German war machine could not risk. But beyond the strategic calculations, there was pride. Hitler's airborne forces had proven themselves in earlier operations, and Crete represented the next grand test, an island defended by determined British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek forces, supported heavily by the local civilians who knew the mountains like the lines of their hands. The British had intelligence, plenty of it in fact. Thanks to ultra-intercepts, Allied commanders on Crete were aware that a German invasion was coming, and they even knew it would involve airborne troops. But knowing something and acting upon it are two very different things. Although they had the information, misunderstandings and disagreements clouded their defensive planning. Some British commanders believed the Germans would prioritize a seaborne assault, despite evidence pointing clearly toward an airborne operation. This misinterpretation would become one of the most decisive errors leading into the battle. While the Germans prepared their elite paratrooper divisions, known as the Fallschirmjäger, Crete prepared in its own way. British and Commonwealth troops dug shallow trenches around the airfields. Greek soldiers, often poorly equipped but fiercely determined, reinforced the defensive lines with whatever weapons they had left from the brutal fighting in mainland Greece. Civilians, too, gathered knives, farming tools, or old hunting rifles, ready to defend their villages if necessary. Crete was no stranger to invasion, but this time the threat felt different, silent, airborne, unpredictable. On the German side, General Kurt Student, commander of the airborne forces, believed that the operation, codenamed Unternehmen Mercury or Operation Mercury, would be swift. After all, airborne troops had stunned the world in earlier campaigns. But Crete was not the Low Countries, and Student underestimated the complexity of dropping thousands of paratroopers onto a defended island surrounded by mountains, cliffs, and unpredictable terrain. Nevertheless, the German high command moved forward confidently, preparing over 500 transport aircraft and hundreds of fighters and bombers to cover the assault. It would be the largest airborne invasion in history up to that moment. As dawn approached on May 20, 1941, Crete lay beneath a gentle Mediterranean breeze. The island was quiet, but the tension in the air felt like something alive. In the early hours, British and New Zealand soldiers scanned the sky from makeshift outposts around Maleme Airfield. For days, reconnaissance flights had been spotted overhead, and the buzzing of Luftwaffe aircraft had become routine enough that some troops barely looked up anymore. Yet that morning felt different, though no one could say why. The hum began barely noticeable, like a soft vibration under the earth. Then it grew. British observers relayed the sound by telephone, aircraft approaching in great numbers. New Zealand soldiers near the airfield gripped their rifles and fixed their bayonets. In towns and villages across western Crete, women rushed to bring children indoors. while older men stepped outside to face whatever was coming. The sound became louder still, turning into a roar that bounced off the hills, filled the valleys, and shook loose dust from stone walls. At 8:00 a.m., the sky erupted. A fleet of German Junkers Ju-52 transport planes swept over the island, flying low enough that soldiers on the ground could see the faces of paratroopers inside. Behind them came gliders, silent and deadly, carrying assault groups tasked with taking key positions before the main force landed. Anti-aircraft guns thundered from British positions, sending black clouds of shrapnel upward. The German aircraft wavered under the impact, but the stream did not stop. They kept coming, wave after wave. Doors opened midair. Hundreds of German paratroopers hurled themselves into the morning sky. Their parachutes blossomed like white flowers. But this image of beauty masked a brutal reality. Many paratroopers were shot before they even reached the ground. Others drifted off course and landed in areas swarming with Allied positions or armed civilians. The air was filled with shouting bullets and the distant echoes of explosions. On the ground, soldiers raced to intercept the descending enemy, while Greek villagers charged with axes, knives, and anything they could carry. Around Maleme Airfield, the fighting became immediate and chaotic. German troops aimed to secure Hill 107, the high ridge overlooking the airfield. If they captured it, they would gain a commanding view and open the way for reinforcements to land. New Zealand soldiers defended the hill with extraordinary bravery, firing on the paratroopers as they touched the earth. The first hours of combat were devastating for the Germans. Many units were wiped out before their leaders could regroup. Students' promise of a quick victory seemed distant as wounded paratroopers cried out across the fields and orchards. But despite their losses, the Germans pushed forward with uncompromising determination. Paratrooper squads that landed intact began forming assault groups, moving through olive groves and rocky gullies, securing small footholds. British and Commonwealth forces found themselves stretched thin across an island too large and too mountainous to defend evenly. Communications lines faltered. Orders became muddled. Some units fought isolated battles without knowing whether the enemy was advancing or retreating. Crete had become a battlefield of fragments, each corner telling its own story of courage and confusion. And as the sun climbed higher, both sides prepared for what would become one of the most intense and pivotal struggles of the entire Mediterranean War. The midday sun over Crete cast long, sharp shadows across the battlefield, revealing the extent of the chaos that had unfolded since the first paratroopers dropped from the sky. Dust clouds drifted over broken stone walls, shattered olive trees, and abandoned farm carts. The island, which only hours earlier echoed with the ordinary rhythm of village life, now pulsed with gunfire, shouts, and the constant drone of circling aircraft. Yet even in the confusion, patterns began to shape themselves. The Germans, though bloodied and shaken, were slowly finding cohesion. The Allied forces, though brave and numerically strong, were now struggling under the weight of miscommunication and scattered defenses. Near Maleme Airfield, the most critical objective of the entire invasion, New Zealand soldiers clung fiercely to their defensive lines. Hill 107, overlooking the airfield, remained their anchor. Throughout the morning, they had repelled wave after wave of German attempts to seize the high ground. Bodies of fallen paratroopers lay scattered across the slopes, their limp parachutes tangled among rocks and shrubs like discarded sails. But the pressure was unrelenting. German units that had landed in fragmented groups gradually merged, forming larger fighting bodies that pushed upwards with increasing momentum. They moved cautiously but persistently, slipping between cover, using ravines to avoid machine gun fire, and coordinating assaults with the support of Stuka dive, bombers screaming down from the sky. The defenders were exhausted. Many had been awake for 2 days, living on adrenaline and brief moments of rest. Ammunition ran low. Water bottles emptied under the merciless sun. Yet despite everything, their spirit held. Hearing rumors that other areas of the island were collapsing, they fought harder, believing that Maleme must not fall. Not now, not ever. It was more than an airfield. It was the lifeline that determined whether the Germans could reinforce their invasion. As long as it remained in Allied hands, Crete could endure. Meanwhile, in the villages to the east and south, Greek civilians joined the struggle with an intensity the Germans had not anticipated. Young men ran barefoot through narrow streets carrying rifles older than themselves. Elderly villagers, hardened by decades of occupation and resistance, confronted paratroopers with farm tools and kitchen knives. Women formed groups to carry ammunition, treat the wounded, or shield children from the fighting. The Fallschirmjäger, trained for military combat, now faced an enemy unlike anything they had encountered. A population that fought not as soldiers but as protectors of their homes, motivated by desperation and anger rather than orders. Despite this fierce resistance, the disaster that would shape the course of the battle was quietly forming on Hill 107. Communications between New Zealand battalions and their command headquarters began to falter. Radio messages were delayed or misinterpreted. Runners sent through enemy fire were killed or never arrived. Officers received conflicting reports. Some said the hill was secure, others that the troops were being overwhelmed. As night approached, one crucial misunderstanding took hold: the belief that German forces had already taken much of Hill 107, and that holding it until morning was impossible. The decision that followed would change the fate of Crete. Late in the night, Allied commanders ordered a withdrawal from Hill 107 to regroup in stronger positions. The troops, weary and unsure, obeyed. They slipped away under the cover of darkness, believing they were retreating from an indefensible position. But the truth was very different. The Germans had not taken the hill. They were battered, scattered, and lying low, barely holding small pockets of ground. Had the defenders remained, Maleme Airfield might have stayed out of German hands. Instead, by dawn, the Germans discovered the unoccupied positions and moved quickly to seize them. For the first time since the operation began, they had the high ground, and the path to the airfield below lay open. The morning of May 21 transformed the battle. Luftwaffe aircraft intensified their bombardment, hammering Allied positions around the airfield. Stukas dived with shrill, horrifying screams that shook the morale of even the bravest soldiers. British anti-aircraft guns answered, turning the skies into a deadly dance of explosions and falling metal. But the tide was shifting. As German troops secured Hill 107, they directed fire onto New Zealand defensive lines below. Machine guns rattled from new angles. Mortars landed with devastating precision. The Allied defenders fought until their last cartridges, but their positions became increasingly untenable. Then came the moment the Germans had been waiting for. With the airfield partially cleared and the high ground secured, transport aircraft began to attempt landings. At first, only a few planes descended, their pilots maneuvering nervously as dust clouds rose from the battered runway. Some aircraft crashed on approach, riddled with holes or struck by stray fire. But others touched down successfully, spilling fresh troops and supplies onto the field. Each successful landing strengthened the German foothold. More planes followed. Soon reinforcements poured in, including heavy weaponry that paratroopers could not bring down in their initial jump. The German invasion, once teetering on the edge of failure, now surged forward with renewed strength. The Fallschirmjäger, previously isolated and vulnerable, expanded their control across western Crete. Maleme Airfield became the beating heart of the operation, pumping in men, ammunition, and even light vehicles. With each hour, their position solidified. Allied commanders recognized the gravity of the situation. A counterattack was planned, a bold attempt to retake the airfield before more reinforcements could arrive. New Zealand, British, and Greek units prepared for the assault with every ounce of energy they had left. Some soldiers had not eaten for nearly a day. Many carried weapons scavenged from the battlefield. Greek volunteers joined them in the darkness, clutching captured German rifles or ancient shotguns. The counterattack began before dawn on May 22. The night air was cool but thick with tension. Allied units advanced silently at first, slipping through the darkness toward the enemy positions. When the fighting erupted, it was sudden and ferocious. Machine guns crackled along the slopes. Explosions lit the night like brief flashes of lightning. Allied soldiers pushed with everything they had, driving the Germans back toward the airfield perimeter. For a moment, it seemed possible. They could take it back, restore the balance, and maybe even turn the battle. But the Germans had strengthened their defenses overnight, and reinforcements continued to land. As dawn lit the horizon, the Allied momentum faltered. German machine guns pinned them down, and the Luftwaffe returned with relentless air support. Stukas screamed overhead once again, dropping bombs with precision and breaking the Allied formations. By midday, the counterattack had collapsed. Exhausted and outnumbered, the Allied forces withdrew, their hope of retaking Maleme slipping away. The Germans now controlled the airfield firmly. The outcome of the Battle of Crete had begun to tilt decisively. The loss of Maleme Airfield reshaped the entire battle. What had begun as a desperate and chaotic German assault, marked by staggering casualties and scattered units, was now evolving into a coordinated and intensifying campaign. With reinforcements landing steadily, the Germans pushed eastward along the northern coast, aiming to link their newly established stronghold with isolated paratrooper groups fighting near Rethymno and Heraklion. The change in momentum was unmistakable. The Allies, once confident that the airborne invasion could be crushed, now found themselves confronting a rapidly strengthening enemy with control of the skies. German pressure increased with each passing hour. Columns of troops advanced cautiously but relentlessly, moving through vineyards, olive groves, and stone villages. Their tactics shifted from desperate survival to structured offensive operations. Stuka dive, bombers roared overhead, targeting roads, supply dumps, and defensive clusters. Allied soldiers learned to fear the distinct siren of an approaching dive. Its shriek meant seconds before impact. Seconds in which nothing could be done but drop to the ground and hope. Even the bravest found their nerves tested under the relentless bombardment. British, New Zealand, Australian, and Greek units dug in along new defensive lines, stretching across the island's northern ridges. They were determined not to give up the ports and towns that connected them to the outside world. Suda Bay, the largest harbor, became a lifeline for evacuation and resupply. Yet the German grip tightened. Reconnaissance flights mapped Allied positions. Paratrooper companies, now reinforced with mountain troops brought in by air, maneuvered expertly across the terrain, outflanking defenders and probing for weaknesses. One of the most remarkable elements of the battle remained the fierce resistance of the Cretan civilians. While regular armies shifted positions and reorganized, the people of Crete continued to wage their own war. Villagers ambushed German patrols in narrow mountain passes, using their knowledge of the terrain to strike and disappear. Women carried messages and supplies between isolated units, moving under fire with extraordinary bravery. Children served as lookouts, hidden among the terraced fields. Though poorly armed, their determination never wavered. This civilian resistance shocked the Germans, who were unprepared for such widespread and aggressive involvement. The reprisals that followed would scar the island long after the fighting ended. By May 24, the conflict had become a grueling march of attrition. Allied commanders, led by General Bernhard Freyberg, now faced the harsh reality that they could not hold the island indefinitely. Their troops were exhausted, scattered, and suffering from dwindling ammunition. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies so completely that movement during daylight became almost impossible. Every convoy, every patrol, every attempt to regroup risked instant detection and air attack. The Admiralty had attempted to send naval forces to block seaborne reinforcements, but the German air supremacy proved devastating. Several British ships were sunk or damaged, leaving the Royal Navy struggling to maintain a presence near Crete. As the Germans consolidated control of the western sector, they turned their focus toward the central and eastern regions. Fighting intensified near Galatas, where New Zealand troops put up a heroic stand. The village changed hands repeatedly in brutal close quarters combat. Stone houses became fortresses. Courtyards turned into killing grounds. Soldiers fought with bayonets, grenades, and anything they could grasp. Greek fighters joined the struggle, adding their knowledge of the twisting lanes and hidden paths. For a time, the defense held firm, delivering one of the most remarkable displays of courage in the entire battle. But numbers and firepower eventually tipped the balance. Under overwhelming pressure and constant bombardment, the defenders were forced to withdraw. With the center collapsing, the British command made a critical decision. Rather than being completely surrounded and annihilated, the Allied forces would withdraw southward across the rugged White Mountains toward the coastal village of Sfakia, where evacuation to Egypt might still be possible. It was a dangerous plan. German forces were pushing eastward, and time was running out. But staying meant certain destruction. The order went out quietly, prepare for withdrawal. The retreat across Crete became a test of endurance, unlike anything many soldiers had ever faced. The terrain was unforgiving. Narrow mountain trails snaked through steep ravines and jagged cliffs. The sun scorched during the day while the nights grew cold and bitter. Troops carried whatever they could: rifles, canteens, blankets, while abandoning heavy equipment. Wounded men were pushed on makeshift stretchers or supported between comrades. Greek civilians guided the columns along hidden paths, leading them through gorges and across high passes, risking their lives to ensure the foreigners who fought beside them might escape. German aircraft hunted relentlessly. Whenever columns were spotted, Stukas attacked mercilessly, forcing soldiers to scatter and cling to whatever cover they could find. Yet the retreat continued, driven by determination, discipline, and the hope of reaching Sfakia before the Germans blocked the way. Throughout the march, civilians offered food, water, and shelter, often giving the last of their supplies to soldiers who had not eaten in days. As the Allies moved south, German troops seized town after town. Heraklion fell after heavy fighting. Rethymno, cut off and isolated, fought valiantly but eventually succumbed. The Germans now controlled most of the northern coast. Their advance through the mountains was slower, hindered by the terrain and stubborn delaying actions by rearguard units. But they were drawing nearer to Sfakia with every hour. By May 28th, the first groups of Allied soldiers reached the evacuation beaches. The sight was both a relief and a heartbreak. British destroyers and transport vessels waited offshore, silhouetted against the moonlight. But there was little time. The Navy could only stay for short periods due to air attacks at dawn. Waves of soldiers boarded through the night, guided by signals and whispered instructions. Some made it onto the boats, many others waited anxiously in long, silent lines stretching along the rocky shoreline. The evacuation continued for several nights, each one marked by tension and desperate hope. The Royal Navy suffered further losses from German air raids but persisted, determined to save as many men as possible. By May 31, the last major evacuation took place. Thousands had been rescued, but thousands more remained, captured hiding in the mountains, or missing in action. On June 1, the Battle of Crete officially came to an end. German forces secured the island after nearly 2 weeks of fierce and costly fighting. Their victory, however, came at a staggering price. The Fallschirmjäger had suffered such heavy casualties that Hitler refused to authorize large-scale airborne operations again. The airborne invasion that was meant to showcase German strength instead revealed its vulnerabilities. For the Allies, the defeat carried painful lessons, but also moments of extraordinary heroism. The defense of Crete, the courage of Greek civilians, the tenacity of Commonwealth troops, and the daring naval evacuations all became legendary. The island had resisted far longer and far harder than the Germans expected, and its story became a symbol of resilience in the darkest days of the war. The Battle of Crete remains one of the most dramatic and significant airborne operations in history. A struggle fought in the skies, in the villages, on the mountains, and across the shattered fields of an island that refused to bow easily. It was a battle of courage and sacrifice, a turning point in airborne warfare, and a chapter of World War II that still echoes across the Mediterranean winds.